What can happen in just 3 seconds? For David Marshall, 3 seconds were enough to make an entire empire tremble. A suspicious glance, a cold remark, a man denied, simply because of the color of his skin. But what they didn't know was this. The man they pushed out of the first-class lounge. He was the very one who had written the operational blueprint for the entire airline industry. Today, you're about to witness a response, not delivered through power, but through intelligence and unwavering integrity. A journey from the bottom of society to the summit of justice. Not for revenge, but to forever change the way the world treats human beings. Stay until the very end, because this isn't just a story. Can you believe it? Just 3 seconds. 3 fleeting seconds at Washington National Airport were all it took for Carol Thompson, the first-class lounge manager, to make a decision steeped in prejudice and unknowingly trigger a chain of events that would bring down an entire airline empire. David Marshall, a black man, impeccably dressed in a tailored Tom Ford suit, carrying a leather briefcase and radiating quiet confidence, walked into the first-class lounge like any other VIP guest. But to Carol Thompson, the receptionist, there was only one thing that stood out: his skin color. She paused. Exactly 3 seconds. A suspicious glare. A cold, furrowed brow. Then she called security. "Sir, we need to re-verify some information. Please come with me." No clear explanation. No specific reason. Not a single voice spoke up. Passengers around him lowered their heads, pretending not to see. A billionaire, a man who had reshaped the artificial intelligence industry, was escorted away like a criminal. David didn't resist. Not a word. But his eyes were steel. And then he reached for his phone and spoke just one sentence. "Activate Protocol Raven. Full scale. Begin." In that moment, no one knew that today's silence would become tomorrow's thunder. A storm was quietly forming, and the empire that once believed itself untouchable was about to be shaken by the very man they had dismissed. David walked silently beside the security officer, but in his mind, a mission was already in motion. No one realized that with a single, simple sentence, "Activate Protocol Raven. Full scale. Begin," an entire corporation had already started its countdown to collapse. Regulus Airways, a luxury airline once believed to be untouchable, had long depended on the security and AI infrastructure built by David's own tech conglomerate. The lines of code, the deep learning algorithms, they had treated as mere tools. We are now turning into double-edged swords and striking back. Within just 60 minutes of Raven being activated, Regulus's internal systems began showing signs, subtle at first but deliberate. Transaction histories were quietly backed up. Internal emails were scanned and behavior analyzed. Passenger data, security footage, access logs, all funneled into an independent system, unnoticed. In a far corner of the airport, Tyler, a young intern who had always looked up to David as a role model, had recognized him the moment he walked in. And he wasn't about to stay silent. Derek from IT Listen, they just escorted David Marshall out of the first-class lounge. I'm not kidding. That's the guy who built our system. At that very moment, a series of algorithms began sorting through the data. Who was behind the misconduct? Who had previous complaints that were buried? Who were the links in a rotten chain that Regulus had chosen to ignore? There were no explosions, no smoke bombs. But make no mistake, this was war. A war without guns, without blood, and yet far more devastating. A war of truth. Regulus had no idea. They had just opened the gates of a technological hell, and the man they deemed unfit for first class. They were now rewriting the very rules of a game they thought they controlled. And this battle had only just begun. Years ago, on a bitterly cold afternoon in Chicago's South Side, an 8-year-old boy sat curled up on the steps of an orphanage. In his hands was an old notebook filled with symbols, diagrams, and equations so complex they'd make a university professor squint. His name was David Marshall. His parents had died in a car accident when he was just 6. The only aunt who promised to take him and never showed up. "And he's not coming, David," said Ms. Patterson, the social worker, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "That's okay," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I'm trying to find a pattern in everything. If I can figure it out, then I won't be scared anymore, because nothing will surprise me." One single sentence, but revealed everything. The obsession of a child who had lost everything and clung to logic as the only way to protect what little he had left. By the age of 14, David had cycled through 4 foster homes. He was bullied for being the only black student in an all-white school, mocked for always clinging to those dumb numbers. But he didn't care. Every night, after shifts at the library and a local cafe, he would sit and code on a battered computer built from discarded parts. One day, his math teacher, Mr. Winters, happened to glance at a handwritten software draft David had left out. He froze. "What are you writing?" he asked. A model to predict financial crises and food supply chain breakdowns. If we can anticipate weather, prices, harvests, we might be able to warn about famine months in advance." Mr. Winters was silent for a long time. "David, this is PhD-level work. You don't belong in this classroom. You belong somewhere that can change the world." At 17, David received a full scholarship to MIT. But 2 years later, just as he refined his algorithm and caught the attention of the World Food Program, he was invited to a meeting by 3 major investors. They smiled, shook their hand, and offered $50,000 for exclusive rights to the algorithm. "Its real value is in the millions," David said, eyes locked on theirs. "It can save lives." "Who are you?" one of them scoffed. "A black college kid. No assets. No connections. We're your only shortcut to success." David walked out of that meeting, taking his algorithm with him. 6 months later, their company launched a similar product and made millions. David received nothing. No credit. No apology. That night, sitting alone in his dorm room, he wrote the final 2 lines in his journal. "They stole what I created, but they'll never steal who I'm becoming. I want to take it back. I'll build it again. Bigger, stronger, unstealable." And now, the man who once sat outside an orphanage, clutching a weathered notebook, is shaking an entire airline empire to its core, with the very brilliance they once dismissed. Less than 24 hours after the Protocol Raven call, Regulus Airways plunged into unprecedented chaos. First-class flights were mysteriously canceled. VIP passengers were downgraded to economy. Payment systems swallowed money without issuing tickets, while the mobile app crashed repeatedly. Inside Regulus's IT department, engineers broke into a sweat as they uncovered strange lines of code, embedded not by external hackers, but from within their own system. No breaches, no foreign intrusions. It was as if the system had begun punishing itself. At the airport, panic erupted. An elderly passenger collapsed in the unmoving check-in line. A mother sat on the cold floor, cradling her child, tears streaming as she realized she wouldn't make it in time to say goodbye to her dying father. A furious businessman slammed his hand on the service counter. "I'm a Diamond Class customer. This is how Regulus treats us." But that was just the surface. Deeper down, a darker truth was being exposed. Every internal file, every edited safety report, every email orchestrating cover-ups with aviation authorities, all were being downloaded into a private analysis center, led by Leah Okoro, David's director of security. Simultaneously, inside Regulus, the weakest links began to snap. An intern named Tyler secretly forwarded internal chat logs to the Cold Dynamics unit. Data engineers uncovered a black file containing political bribes, including one with Senator Green's name on it. A recovered video showed Regulus CEO Douglas Stanton sweeping aside a crash report, footage pulled from a hidden backup server. The company's foundation was unraveling. Boardrooms turned into shouting matches. Once proud employees stared at one another in disbelief. What is happening? Weren't we the good guys? What they didn't know. Who was orchestrating the storm? This entire earthquake had been triggered by one man. A man was once dismissed and quietly escorted out of a first-class lounge, despite holding a valid ticket. Now he had returned, not for an apology, but to confront the truth. As Regulus Airways systems spiraled into chaos, inside the airport, 2 individuals seemingly insignificant links in the chain, were about to make the biggest decisions of their lives. Tyler, the young black intern who had recognized David, stood hidden behind a pillar near the security checkpoint. His phone was in his hand, sending encrypted messages to someone in the IT department. I think they just kicked out the wrong guy. That man was David Marshall. Elsewhere, Victor Benson, the head of security, was reviewing security footage of the entire incident. When he watched the moment Sandra shoved David's documents aside with a look of disdain, his fists clenched. He had once served as a Marine. He believed in honor. But now, he realized he had been guarding a system that no longer deserved protection. That evening, both Tyler and Victor were placed on temporary suspension. The reason? Violation of security protocol and improper internal communication. But the very next day, they each received an email from an unfamiliar address. Cole.protocol@securemail.com. Thank you for not staying silent. I once stood alone. Now we'll stand together. Attached was an official invitation to join Cole Air's internal investigation and reform task force. And they weren't the only ones. Across social media, footage of Sandra's discriminatory treatment of David was going viral. In the video, the voice of a female passenger cracked with guilt. I stayed silent back then, and now I feel ashamed. In the comments section, thousands shared their own stories. Times they had been ignored, humiliated, dismissed, because of the color of their skin, the way they spoke, or the clothes they wore into places deemed too upscale. Regulus Airways headquarters, 49th floor, a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the entire city. Usually, this is where multi-million-dollar deals are signed. Today, no contracts lie on the table. Only truth. Douglas Stanton, CEO of Regulus, sat across the table, his hands gripping the chair's armrests as if to hold on to the last threads of composure. Before him, David Marshall did not raise his voice. He simply opened his tablet. On the screen appeared 6 years of falsified financial reports, 12 covered-up sexual harassment cases, 3 major aviation accidents were erased from records, offshore transactions, internal emails, and messages with political leaders. Douglas could barely breathe. "What do you want?" he asked. David didn't smile. "I want Regulus. Not to bury it in ruins, but to rebuild it from the ashes. The way it was meant to be." Douglas's voice rose. "You're attacking our reputation." David replied calmly. "Of course. That reputation was built on lies. I'm about to replace it with trust." Outside the glass walls, a Cole Air jet soared past the skyline. That was the moment Douglas understood. He hadn't just lost a negotiation. He had lost the future. David offered to buy Regulus for 1/3 of its market value. But under one condition. No employee would be laid off. The system would remain intact. The name would change. The past would stay behind. Douglas looked David in the eyes one last time. "I thought you just wanted revenge." David responded, "I want justice. And sometimes justice looks like a revolution." Douglas signed, in silence, in regret, in the cold helplessness of a man who had lost all control. And in that moment, David Marshall became the co-architect of a new era in aviation. An old empire built on fear and privilege, now stepping aside for fairness, transparency, and humanity. 3 months after the signing of that fateful agreement, on a crisp morning at Washington National, the very place where David Marshall had once been humiliated for the color of his skin, a moment unlike any the aviation industry had seen was unfolding. Cole Air was officially launched. The airport was draped in banners bearing the words, "Where everyone belongs," a phrase that had become the guiding principle behind David's entire journey. On stage, David stood among the new leadership team. Tyler, the young intern who had bravely passed on internal information, now stood as head of training. Victor Benson, once suspended for choosing what was right, now held the position of chief of security for the entire system. Erica, the young employee who had once spoken up against injustice, was now head of passenger experience. They weren't just new hires. They were symbols of change. David began his speech in a calm, resonant voice, one that carried the weight of everything he had endured. "I once walked into this place with a first-class ticket and was treated like an intruder. Today, I return, not for vengeance, but to give this place a second chance. Because justice is not about destruction. It's about restoring what should have been right from the beginning. Following his speech, Cole Air's inaugural flight took off. Flight number CA001 soared into the blue sky, catching the golden light of the morning sun. No one cried, but many stood in still silence, because they knew this was more than a flight. 3 weeks after Cole Air officially took flight, David Marshall returned to the place that had once witnessed his forgotten childhood, Grace Home Orphanage, tucked away in Chicago's South Side. It was where he had once sat curled in the dark, clutching a notebook full of formulas no one had cared to look at. The sky that day was strikingly clear, as if even the past he once tried to forget had returned, calmly, in the faded wrinkles of the orphanage's old walls. The children of Grace Home burst outside when they heard Uncle David was coming. David crouched down, ruffling the hair of a little boy before saying, "I grew up here too. That corner of the room, where the old wooden bed used to be, that's where I drew my first tornado prediction chart before storm season. And now I've graduated." At the press conference that followed, David made 2 major announcements. The Marshall Fund Scholarship, valued at $50 million, would cover tuition and boarding costs for underprivileged students across the country. A career and leadership support center for youth would be built right on the orphanage's old grounds. He ended, voice trembling but without a single word of pity. "They once used the system to keep us down. I'll use a new system to lift everyone up." Above, a Cole Air jet streaked through the blue sky. This time, there was no suffocating silence, no cold rejection. Only hope. Only the upward gaze of someone once cast aside. And that's when viewers understood. This wasn't about revenge. Not about money. This was a transformation. They said it only took 3 seconds to misjudge a person. Let me tell you something. For almost 2 decades as an executive at Regulus Airways, the most luxurious airline in the world, I thrived on those 3 seconds. I met thousands of VIP passengers. I knew who belonged and who didn't. And that morning at Washington National Airport, I saw a man walk into the first-class lounge, wearing a sharp suit, pulling a leather suitcase, moving with the ease of someone who owned the place. But something was off. Not his clothes. His eyes. His presence. His skin color. I wasn't racist. I was classist. And don't pretend you aren't, too. I called security. Not because I made a mistake. Because it was protocol. Because it was what earned me promotions, year-end bonuses, and keynote spots at global conferences about elite customer service. I remember his eyes. Cold. Silent. As if I were invisible. A man of power without a name. Then he pulled out his phone. No threats. No shouting. Just 4 words. "Activate Protocol Raven." I smirked at the time. I'd heard empty threats from hundreds of important people. I was still Carol Thompson. I was Regulus. But this time, it was different. Servers flickered. Emails vanished. Payment systems crashed. Passengers flooded service desks, yelling, slamming fists. And then someone said, "David Marshall, founder of Cole Dynamics, was escorted out of first class this morning." I froze. I had just expelled the man who built the entire system Regulus was running on. I, Carol Thompson, who once believed the airline industry revolved around me, had ignited a technological reckoning. I didn't cry. I didn't apologize. I just stood there, watching a great machine I once helped operate, now crumble line by line, beat by beat. And I realized, some names don't need business cards. Some people don't need to scream to silence an entire world. David Marshall was one of them. I once thought technology was just a tool. Booking systems, security cameras, customer analytics. All things I used to maintain control. I held the keys. But with one phrase, "Activate Protocol Raven," I became a pawn in a game I never even understood. At first, it was just glitches. The lounge system couldn't recognize VIPs, and the ticket printer jammed. But within 60 minutes, it felt like Regulus Airways had been hijacked from the inside. The tech team called, panicked. "Carol, some AI is auto-extracting internal data. It's not external. No signs of hacking." The command. "It's internal. Like it was built that way." I didn't believe it. I refused to believe it. Then I heard Tyler, That intern who always lingered around IT, whisper. You know who that was, right? That's David Marshall. He built this system. Regulus just licensed it. My world collapsed. It felt like someone had shoved me off a tower of glass. The servers began scanning emails, call logs, and internal reports. Documents I had adjusted slightly to pass compliance inspections, now uploading to an anonymous IP address. In the emergency meeting, I shouted, "Who authorized the system to share data externally?" A trembling engineer answered, "No one, ma'am, unless he left a backup command when he built the system." I felt like a rat trapped in a hall of mirrors. Every lie I'd told, every time I dismissed someone, every biased decision I made, all of it reflected back at me, multiplied, and striking me down. And the worst part was, I couldn't deny any of it. Not because David Marshall yelled. He didn't go on TV. He didn't make a single statement. There were no press conferences. Just the system, once Regulus's proudest creation, now speaking for him. And it spoke with truth. The emails I ignored. The complaints I brushed off. The moments I prioritized the right people based on appearances rather than data. All of it exposed. I, Carol Thompson, once the queen of Regulus first class, now sat in front of a screen, watching line after line of truth dismantle my legacy. And for the first time in my life, I had no one left to command, because no one was listening anymore. And the worst part? This nightmare had only just begun. I used to think justice was a joke, a fantasy for the weak, begging for mercy. In my world, the powerful were right. The weak stayed silent. That's what I believed, until David Marshall walked into the boardroom on the 49th floor. Not to threaten, not to sue, not to demand an apology. He didn't need anyone to believe him, because the very empire I helped build had turned itself in. I remember the moment he opened his tablet. Everything broke loose like a dam bursting. The accidents I downplayed. The discrimination I justified with service standards. Everything now lay bare. Irrefutable. Then I watched Douglas, the CEO I once admired, sign the final transfer agreement. No resistance. No negotiation. Like a man signing his own execution order. David didn't smile. He didn't need to. Real victory doesn't need applause. He simply said, "I didn't come to destroy Regulus. I came to bury the lie it became." That sentence still haunts me. I was dismissed just 2 days later. No investigation. No formal hearing. I vanished from the Regulus system like I'd never existed. No recognition. No one defended me. Not a word from the colleagues who once toasted beside me at year-end galas. And David? He became the face of digital justice. His name is mentioned on every aviation forum. Yet he remains silent. No one knows where he is now. Maybe that's what scares me the most. The silence of those who know too much. And me? I still sit here, sometimes staring at a cup of cold tea, wondering, did I lose everything in just 3 seconds of prejudice? Or had I been sowing my own downfall for years? By believing that power gave me the right to look down on others? I don't know, but I know one thing. When justice arrives without raising its voice, it hurts more than any sentence ever could. They once said David didn't belong in first class. Today, he doesn't just belong. He decides he gets to walk through that door. From an abandoned child, a young man whose work was stolen, whose worth was questioned because of the color of his skin, David didn't choose the path of hatred. He chose to rebuild an entire system, one where everyone has a place and no one is left behind. And if you're watching this video, maybe you, too, have been underestimated. Maybe you, too, have been looked down on. Remember this. You don't need to look like anyone else to deserve respect. Share your story in the comments, because the words you write, it might be the light that someone else needs to find their way. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. So together with Toch Story, we can spread journeys that don't just inspire, but awaken a deeper belief in justice. Because there are stories that isn't meant to be heard. They're meant to be felt and remembered for a lifetime. David Marshall's story didn't let me sit still. It reminded me of a truth we all know but rarely dare to confront. That no matter how talented you are, sometimes the world still only sees your skin, your background, and your appearance. But what I admire most isn't David's power. It's how he used it. Not to strike back, not to destroy, but to rebuild a system where dignity is standard for everyone. When life pushes you to the bottom, you have two choices. You can become bitter, or become the light that guides others through the same darkness. David chose the second path, and I believe that's why this story deserves to be told. Not just once, but again and again. If you've ever been misjudged, if you've ever stayed silent because you thought your voice didn't matter, remember this. Prolonged silence fuels injustice, but the right voice at the right moment can change the world.